Not a bad definition. Well, I am pleased to be here, and my main reason for coming is I know to some extent when I come to speak to advocacy groups that I'm preaching to the converted. So why do I do it? Well, because we've got to get off our rear ends, and we've got to be aggressive. And the tide is running in our favor. I'll talk about that in a second. But what I need you all to do is deliver a message to your congressmen and your senators that we need infrastructure spending, and we need it at a significant rate. What I'm afraid of happening is, with the election coming up, with MAP 21 needing to be reauthorized, with the Highway Trust Fund probably going broke in August or September, I'm afraid they'll pass a 2-month extension or a 3-month extension to get us through the election, to get them off the hot seat. Well, that means we miss a construction cycle, and that's extraordinarily important in the northern half of the country, extraordinarily important in getting us the ability to do something about our bridges and our roads and other parts of our transportation infrastructure. So it's important that they get the message that we want them to act, and we want them to act soon, so we can make that construction schedule and not kick the can down the road. I'm so sick and tired, and I know you are too, of Congress on every major issue just kicking the can down the road. They have to bite the bullet and do what's necessary, and they have to understand that there has to be investment. I just left a meeting put on by the Progressive Policy Institute and the National League of Cities, and the Progressive Policy Institute in their report said, look, the only way we're going to be able to do anything about tackling the deficit in infrastructure investment is for all levels of government to step up their financial commitment. And they're absolutely right. Look, we're not going to solve the infrastructure problem by eliminating burdensome regulations and speeding up regulations. We should do that. MAP 21 took a step in the right direction. It's very good, but it doesn't matter how fast we can move the EIS if there's no money for the project. There's not going to be an EIS. It doesn't matter. Secondly, we can't rely on the private sector. I am a strong advocate of private sector involvement, 3 Ps. I tried to do the biggest 3P in the country when it came to transportation. We tried to privatize the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The legislature didn't go for it for a lot of reasons, but we tried. I'm probably the strongest advocate of an infrastructure bank. But understand, take those 4,500 Pennsylvania bridges. How many do you think the private sector would be interested in financing the repair of? Maybe 10 could be told. Maybe 10. And the bottom line is the private sector, and we want them in, and we want their tens of billions of dollars in, but they're not going to do something if there isn't a return on the investment. They're not charities. They're doing it to make money. And most of our infrastructure work, most of the revitalization, most of the repair, a lot of the expansion can't be done with a return on the investment. So in the end, the rubber's going to hit the road. It has to be public sector investment. It has to be at all levels. Cities have to step up, states have to step up, and the federal government has to step up. You know, I was on a show my last year as governor. I was on one of the Sunday shows on ABC. And the moderator asked me to watch a clip. It was around this time of the year. He asked me to watch a clip of the CCAP convention. And Mike Pence, at that time the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, now the governor of Indiana, Mike Pence was speaking, and he was pounding the podium. He says, yes, we're the party of no. We say no to borrowing. We say no to spending. We say no to taxes. And the clip ended, and the moderator said, Governor, what do you think? I said, that's a prescription for disaster. I said, name me one American company that has grown successful that didn't invest in its own growth. You can't. And we're no different. We have to invest in our own growth. If we're going to keep growing, if we're going to keep being economically competitive, we have to invest. So Fox News, never one to avoid controversy, saw that little vignette, and they invited Congressman Pence and myself on TV the next Sunday. And he went first, and he gave the same riff, very forcefully and very persuasively. Then it came time for me to speak. And I've done a lot of TV, and now I do it for a living. And you're always told, look at the camera. But this time, for a reason, I turned from the camera, and I was sitting here, and Congressman Pence was here. I turned from the camera, and I turned to the congressman. I said, Congressman, you seem like a reasonable man to me. Now, truth be told, he didn't seem like a reasonable man to me. But I've done enough TV to know that you want to be the good guy, right? So I said, Congressman, you seem like a reasonable man to me. Can you tell our viewers how we're going to maintain our bridges, our roads, our highways, our pipelines, how we're going to maintain them in good condition if we don't invest in their maintenance and revitalization? And Mike Pence is a smart guy, make no mistake about it, and a very able guy. He sat there and for 8 or 9 seconds didn't say a thing. Now, 8 or 9 seconds doesn't seem like a lot for you, but have you ever heard 8 or 9 seconds of silence on TV? It's deafening. And finally, the best he could come up with was, there you Democrats go again, using the word invest when you really mean spend. Well, in all due respect, Congressman, no, we mean invest. There's a difference. You invest in something that will create a long-run benefit to you or the people you're representing. Infrastructure is an investment. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. And we better do something about it soon. The state of the American infrastructure is horrible. You know that better or as well as I do. The American Society of Civil Engineers issued a report, and we got a D+. D+. What would you think if your child brought home a report card from school and it was all D+? You wouldn't be very happy, and you shouldn't be very happy about the state of the American infrastructure. In 5 years since the last ASCE report, where there was improvement, slight improvement in 3 areas: roads and bridges, water and wastewater, and rail freight. Now, I will give 2 tickets to the next 76ers World Championship game. Oh, ye of little faith. If you can tell me what those 3 things have in common, seriously. Anybody tell me what those 3 things have in common? Rail freight, water and wastewater, and roads and bridges. I'll give you a hint. It's one word, and it's a word that has a hated connotation in Washington. Who said stimulus? Oh, you're young. You might make it. Stimulus. All of them received significant funding in stimulus. Pennsylvania received $1 billion for roads and bridges. And the reason we went from 6,600 to 4,500 is because of stimulus, in part, and in part of the money I put in. So it's not an accident. When you invest, you improve the infrastructure. We're the only one of the 20 G8 of the 20 G20 nations to not have in the last 20 years a significant 5 or 10-year infrastructure repair and revitalization program. Japan, a country a fifth of the size of us, spent $1 trillion on its infrastructure revitalization. And if you look at it, it's interesting. The ASCE says we need to spend $1.6 trillion additional dollars in the next 8 years. That's $200 billion a year. The BAF report, called Falling Apart, Falling Behind, said we needed to spend $200 billion more a year over the next 10 years. The Congressional Surface Transportation Reform Committee estimated that we needed to spend an additional $80 billion a year just on surface transportation. The other reports I quoted were on overall infrastructure, including everything. It's clear that we have to spend significantly more money, and it's got to come from somewhere. The World Economic Forum, 10 years ago, we were #1 in infrastructure, in the competitiveness of our infrastructure. And frankly, up until 10 years ago, we were #1 for all of history, because we had the best railroad system way before anybody else did. We had the best interstate highway system way before anybody else did. Our ports were the state-of-the-art way before anybody else had state-of-the-art ports. And now we've fallen behind terribly. On that same report, we now rank 15th most competitive infrastructure in the world. 15th. Our rail, port, and airport infrastructure ranks 16th, 17th, and 18th respectively. It's a disgrace. We have let it happen. And it doesn't matter what part of the infrastructure, what part of the surface transportation infrastructure you look at, mass transit, high-speed rail, bridges, highways, you name it. We're literally falling apart and falling behind. And it is time that we do something about it. And you know, it's interesting. Politicians should stand up and do the right thing, regardless of the political consequences. There comes a time when you've got to do something that's more important than just your own political survival. In the book I wrote, A Nation of Wusses, I titled all the chapters myself, and my most favorite chapter was Stand and Defend. There are some things worth losing for. And by the way, guess who's smarter than the elected officials? The public. Public's smarter. Last year, there were referendums on transportation infrastructure on the ballot. Every one of them called for either increased tolling, increased taxes, or increased borrowing. 91% of them passed. In the presidential year, 79% of them passed. In 2010, arguably the most conservative anti-spending election we've ever had, 61% of them passed by a percentage of 64%. The American people, Republican and Democrat, independent, they all understand we need to spend more money on our infrastructure. They're more supportive when they know what the project is. And by the way, that's red state, blue state. Charleston, South Carolina, the voters overwhelmingly approved raising their own sales tax to pay for the revitalization of the Port of Charleston. Why? Because they know that the Port of Charleston is key to the Charleston region's economy. They're not dumb. People aren't dumb. They know you get what you pay for. And if you don't invest in infrastructure, it is going to crumble. It is going to crumble. If we don't meet our obligations under the Highway Trust Fund, and David Walker, the great former controller of the United States, said we shouldn't call it the Highway Trust Fund because no one trusts it and we don't fund it anymore. But if we don't fulfill our obligations in the Highway Trust Fund, shame on us. And what do you think we're going to do? As I said, we're likely to kick the can down the road unless we all get riled up and tell Congress that they can't do it again. We can't miss a construction cycle. This is serious business. Bridges collapse and fall. Roads that are in disrepair cause traffic accidents. The quality of life, congestion can sap hours and hours and days out of a person's lifetime. Time that they could be spending with their kids or time that they could be more productive on the job. And economically competitive, we are absolutely getting our rear ends kicked because we don't have an infrastructure that's competitive. Goods movement right now is the key to economic competitiveness. It's the key to the export business. I don't know if any of you are aware, there's something called metallurgical coal. It is the feedstock for coke, which in turn is the feedstock for steel production. It's only found in Australia and the United States. China, which has a lot of coal, doesn't have metallurgical coal. But China, because it's producing so much steel, desperately needs metallurgical coal. So it imports it from Australia or the US. Well, Australia gets its coal from its mines, which are right in the center of the country, and Australia is a big country. They get their coal from their mines to their ports in 1/4 of the time that we do. Not surprising. Anybody here aware of the fact that you can take a freight train from Los Angeles to the western edge of the Chicago freight yards in the same time as you can get from the western edge of the Chicago freight yards to the eastern edge of the Chicago freight yards, but because of the congestion? Would that it was funny. It isn't. You know, they're dredging the Panama Canal so these super tankers can come through the canal. Super tankers are going to come from Asia and going to come up the Atlantic seaboard. Only 2 of our 15 Atlantic ports are dredged sufficiently to receive the super tankers, which means they're going to go to Canada. They're going to unload in Canada. And we will lose tens of thousands of longshoreman jobs that pay $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year. We will lose tens of thousands of trucker jobs that pay $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year to Canada because we're not ready. And there's something called the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, another trust fund, which the Congress has raided for the general fund. They barely let half of the money that is in that fund, which comes from fees, they let half of that money go for dredging and other work that harbors need. And half of it goes to the general fund to try to plug the hole in the deficit. Well, it's time for us to act. And BAF favors a comprehensive plan of how to deal with the situation of having inadequate funding. First, raise the gas tax. Let's be honest with the American people. We have to raise the gas tax. They may not want to hear it, but after a while, if you explain to them the cost of doing nothing, if you raise the gas tax $100 a year for the average driver, they will make money in that, because if we get roads and bridges that are in better condition, that eliminate congestion, studies show that the average American driver spends $818 a year on repairs that could be avoided and on idling and using fuel and congestion. They'll make $700 if we raise their taxes $100, if we use the money right and wisely. We've got to explain the cost of inaction to business and the cost of inaction to their pocketbooks as well. Raise the gas tax, but do it for a limited period of time. And at the end of that time, say in the legislation that we will convert to some form of vehicles miles traveled, because the gas tax is outmoded for a lot of reasons. It's got a definitively short lifespan. We can now do VMTs that are not intrusive and won't violate people's privacy. The technology is evolving rapidly to do that. Representative Blumenauer from Oregon has a bill that does just that, raises the gas tax, sunsets it, and to be replaced by a VMT. We need to do that, and we need to do that fast. Next, we should bring back Building America bonds. Building America bonds, which helped us defray a significant portion of our debt service, were a tremendous plus. A tremendous plus. You can tell how important they were to state and local governments because there was a stampede near the end of the lifespan of Building America's bonds. Let's bring them back. The federal government spends some money on it, but they spend money, and it's money that absolutely goes directly into things that are job producing and will make us economically competitive. Let's lift the cap on private activity bonds. If we're serious about getting the private sector in, we've got to make sure they have a return on investment. Number one, lift the cap on private activity bonds. Number two, raise TIFIA. Now, I know they just raised TIFIA in MAP 21 from $225 million a year to $1 billion. There's still a huge backlog in requests to use that TIFIA money. Make TIFIA a $10 billion a year program. We will get such a return on that investment, it will knock your socks off. And then lastly, the Congress must lift the ban on tolling federally accredited highways. They must lift the ban. If they want the private sector to invest, they've got to give us tools to allow them a return on investment. And this idea that, well, we paid for it once, well, that's idiotic. If there's anybody from Congress here, I apologize, but it's idiotic. It's idiotic because you buy a car. Let's assume you save up your money and you buy the car of your dreams for $45,000 a year. Would you stop paying for your car if the warranty wasn't good enough? Would you not pay to maintain it? You just put $45,000 in it. You're going to not maintain it year after year after year? Of course not. You have to maintain it. I tried to get, right now there are 3 pilots supposedly to be granted by the federal DOT for tolling interstates. I tried to get a pilot, one of those pilots, for I-80. I-80 is a road that goes through the length of Pennsylvania, and we are the pass-through state of the nation. It goes through our mountains, high elevation. It gets terrible weather, high elevation, tons of trucks that go to avoid tolls through I-80. It's an untolled road. I tried to get the right to toll it. We spend, Pennsylvania, $200 million a year on maintaining I-80. So you may have paid for it once, but it's time to give us the wherewithal to pay for it a second time. You've got to lift the ban on tolling. And we can't just do it for new expansion for hot lanes. We're not going to need hot lanes. We're going to need our current stock repaired and revitalized. If we do those 5 things, we'll be taking a giant step in the right direction. But the last thing we ought to do, and I've been working on this since my Rebuild America days, was do one thing that in the federal government, that every county, every city, every state has. Name me one thing that the federal government doesn't have in its governmental structure, in its financing, that states, counties, and cities have. Capital budget. Is that the same guy? That wasn't you. Who was that? Capital budget. Raise your hand. I want to see if you won't make it to the Sixers championship game. But don't feel bad. I'm leaving money in my will to pay for this guy's tickets for the Sixers. Capital budget. Infrastructure, which is a long-term investment, should not compete with food stamps. It should not compete with education. It should not compete with the military. It's got to have the ability to stand on its own. Every business has a capital budget. Every governmental entity, except the federal government, has a capital budget. President Clinton convened a commission on the capital budget. They were going to recommend it, and then Treasury stepped in, so they made no recommendation. Well, it's time to bite the bullet, change the Budget Act, let us have a capital budget. That's the only way we're going to do it. And once we have a capital budget, let's go on a 10-year revitalization program. Let's budget between state, local, and federal $200 billion a year more. And if you don't believe that that's achievable or worthwhile, the Congressional Budget Office in 2008, I recommend you pick it up and read it, recommended $180 billion a year in additional funding on infrastructure, saying the taxes it would generate, the economic activity it would generate, and the social benefit it would generate make it extremely worthwhile. It's time we do that. And let me close by telling you, everybody knows what I'm talking about is true. I testified, Congressman Schuster from Pennsylvania, his first hearing as head of the House Budget Committee. I testified with Danny O'Sullivan from the Laborers and the fellow who's head of, Frank Donahue, the head of the chamber. The three of us were there for 3 hours. And we were there, we testified and answered a lot of questions, but every one of the 60 members of the committee who were there that day made a statement. And they were all standing up and saying, we need to spend more money on infrastructure. Guys would stand up, or women. I'm a Tea Party member, but I believe we need to spend more on infrastructure. We all know the truth. The American infrastructure is crumbling. We're falling behind, falling apart, and we better do something about it fast. But there's such an anti-spending mania in Washington. They can't distinguish between spending that's good and spending that's wrong or wasteful. This spending is good, it's necessary, it's vitally necessary. And it's time for us to do tough things again. And if putting up a vote to raise the gas tax is tough, it's time we did it. It's time we have some patriots who are going to do something to change the destiny of this country. If you look at America, we've always in our history had the ability to do tough and difficult things. We never were afraid of risks. Think about it. Think back to 1776. We were a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, and we dared to think we could beat the greatest army and the greatest navy in the world with the Hessians throwing that on top of them. It was like Appalachian State daring to think they could beat Michigan in football. But they did. But they did. And at every time that we needed someone to make a tough decision, a bold and courageous decision, fortunately we had Americans who were willing to do that. Thomas Jefferson was told by his engineers that we couldn't build the Erie Canal, and he was told by members of Congress that it was too expensive, but he went ahead and set the stage for it anyway. We built it, and it opened up an incredible flow of commerce from the Atlantic coast to the Midwest. Abraham Lincoln, fighting the Civil War to keep the Union together, still understood the benefits of building the transatlantic railway system. And his experts told him, too expensive, and you couldn't pull the tracks over the Rockies. It never happened. He didn't listen, and we did. We built it. Dwight Eisenhower knew that we needed to be economically competitive. We needed to have the best infrastructure in the world, and that meant building an interstate highway system. And he opened up all of America with the interstate highway system. It went to places that never dreamed they would be part of our economy or of our national economy, ever dreamed it, and they did. You know, I grew up, I was a college student during John F. Kennedy's short time as president. And like most college students, I was enamored with Kennedy. And he said some of the most incredible, moving, and poetic things. But my favorite John F. Kennedy speech was the one he made the day after Sputnik circled the globe. And everyone was panicking because Russia had beat us into space. And you may remember, or you may have read about it, that he said that day that America would put a man on the moon before the end of the 60s. His scientists told him it was impossible. Congress said it was too expensive. And he said, we're going to do it. And he said, we do these things not because they're easy. We do them because they're hard. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to absolutely beat the living daylights out of your representatives, because it's time for us to do something that's hard, to put up a tough vote, to be courageous, to care about your country, to care about the country that was built by risk takers, that had that Western frontier can-do spirit. We were Americans and faced with challenges. There's no challenge we couldn't surmount. And now we're faced with a challenge. We're the 15th best infrastructure in the world. The country that invested broadband has the 16th best broadband system. Our electrical grid doesn't reach places that are crucial. Our whole infrastructure is falling apart, but particularly our transportation infrastructure. It's time that we do big, courageous things again. We can do this. We're Americans, and we've always come through in the past. Let's do it one more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Rendell. Let everybody who agrees with what Reverend Rendell said say amen. Amen. All right. Thank you so much. We would ask, we'd like to be able to clone Governor Rendell and send him into all 435 congressional districts, but I think we're going to have to form that cloning ourselves. We're going to have to embody that passion and spirit, that remarkable candor.